Hello, and welcome to a short introduction to the London Naval Conference and London Naval Treaty of 1930, the first part of a planned series to be presented by Dr Alex Clarke, who holds a History PhD, and me, Dan Friedman, who has a GCSE in History. The conference opened on the 21st of January 1930, and there was a opening dinner the night before, which I thought you might enjoy looking at the menu for slightly more than looking at 5 photos of boring old white men. The delegation leaders were an array of senior politicians. Ramsay MacDonald, the British Prime Minister, acted as host. He'd been Prime Minister in 1924 for a bit under a year, and then came to power with a minority government in June 1929, supported by Liberals under Lloyd George. Ramsay MacDonald was a committed pacifist and had in fact resigned the leadership of the Labour Party in 1914 due to disagreeing with the party's support for the government after the start of World War I, and he'd warned against the Versailles Treaty. But equally, he also opposed communism and was part of keeping the Labour Party from going communist after the Russian Revolution. So it seems he was certainly a committed supporter of peace and stood by this position even if it cost him quite a lot, personally or politically. Henry Stimson was Secretary of State for Herbert Hoover's presidency from March 1929. He'd been Secretary of State for War from 1911 to 1913 under Taft, and would go on to hold that post again under FDR and Harry Truman. Stimson had also supported Teddy Roosevelt's attempts to raise a volunteer force during World War I, and when President Wilson quashed that plan, he joined the main US Army and served in France, reaching the rank of colonel by August 1918. In 1927, he'd been sent to negotiate an end to the Nicaraguan Civil War, which was reasonably successful, and upon appointment as Secretary of State in 1929, he'd shut down the Cipher Bureau as unethical and ungentlemanly, and he also seems to have expressed views that suggest a high degree of white male Western superiority and arrogance. I find him a harder man to pin down than Ramsay MacDonald, in that he seems to have had strong convictions and to have sought peace, but was prepared to stand up to aggression, up to and including responding with war, and clearly supporting that, where Ramsay MacDonald didn't. Wakatsuki Raijiro was a career civil servant of samurai lineage. His main background had initially been in sort of finance, and he'd been appointed to the House of Peers, the upper house in the Japanese parliament and government set up at the time in 1911, before going on to serve as Minister of Finance in the early 1910s. He was Home Minister in 1924, where he oversaw enacting a widening of suffrage in Japan, albeit that only extended it to all males aged over 25, and oversaw the Peace Preservation Law of 1925 that sadly is less international peace and more suppressing dissent against the government, particularly communism. He'd been Prime Minister for a bit over a year in the mid-20s and was very much a sort of notable statesman at the time of his appointment as Chief Delegate to the London Naval Conference, and when he got home he would push for a speedy ratification of it. André Tardieu was the Prime Minister of France. He'd started as a diplomat and then moved into journalism before even World War I. With World War I, he enlisted in 1914 and served until being wounded and discharged in 1916. He supported Clemenceau during the Paris Peace Conferences, which led to the Treaty of Versailles, and was Commissioner for Franco-American War Cooperation. He remained prominent in politics and government in the 1920s and became Prime Minister in November 1929. He focused his premiership on investment and sort of social fabric of France, seeking prosperity through a sort of dynamic and supported capitalism. So supported government intervention in welfare measures such as public works, social insurance, free education, things like that. Dino Grandi was the fifth of the delegates or delegation leaders, and he is slightly different. An early joiner of Mussolini's black shirts, he was generally associated with the more radical and violent wing of the fascist regime, and it's kind of the supporting groups within that. But he'd been part of the government since the fascist takeover in late 1922, although he'd only become the Minister of Foreign Affairs in September 1929. After the conference, I'm not quite clear whether he was successful and whether his appointment as the ambassador to Britain for Italy from 1932 to 1939 was a promotion, demotion, moved sideways, or quite what led to it, but that was what happened. The conference ran from the 21st of January to the 22nd of April 1930. The ratification process was completed on the 27th of October 1930, and that was the point when it became effective. The treaty, to run through the key parts of it, was made up of 5 parts. Part 1 covered capital ships and aircraft carriers. There was a freeze on new capital ship construction, continued from the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922-23, and that was due to run until the expiry of the whole Washington Naval Treaty at the end of 1936. The 3 navies, which still had a load of what might be called legacy battleships or capital ships, the Royal Navy, US Navy, and Imperial Japanese Navy, got rid of some of their oldest ships, for example the Iron Duke class and HMS Tiger, on the part of the British. There was then a redefinition of quite how aircraft carriers would be considered. This really was to say that there was no longer an exclusion of aircraft carriers of less than 10,000 tons standard displacement from a nation's aircraft carrier allocation and consideration. Then Part 2 extended the Washington Naval Treaty's idea of standard displacement to ships under 10,000 tons standard displacement, and also limited submarines to no more than 2,000 tons and guns of roughly destroyer caliber. This was a response to ideas of cruiser submarines as exemplified by the Surkov, but being developed by a lot of countries. The other area was the treaty exempt ships. This was those of less than 600 tons standard displacement, which were really viewed as being only capable of kind of defensive operations as torpedo boats or similar, and the 2,000 ton and below sloops and the like. To briefly touch on Part 4, that was the making illegal of unrestricted submarine warfare, and that didn't have an expiry, and I think technically might still be part of international law, not 100% sure. But Part 3 was more of a consideration in that it heavily limited the construction of ships. It was only agreed and applied to Britain, the US, and Japan, or British Empire, British Empire, Commonwealth, Dominions. gets a little complicated, but if we just say the British. And this started to offer allocations and to categorise ships which were of 10,000 tons standard displacement and below. You get the subcategories A and B of cruisers, which are effectively the light and heavy cruisers, depending on whether they have for pretty much everyone, an 8-inch armament. I suppose that the Japanese made a few which had a 200mm instead of 203mm guns, but realistically that's what we're talking about. And those with a 6-inch or 6.1-inch, which is 155mm, which some of you may know from modern artillery. The other novelty was to introduce a division of destroyers. So not only were destroyers now a classification, being ships of less than being limited to less than 1,850 tons standard displacement and guns of no more than 5.1 inches, but also they were, which is 130mm, sorry, but they were also limited so that only 16% of ships could actually be built up to that weight, with the rest being supposed to be of 1,500 tons standard displacement or less. Now this was quite a change, and that ratio of 84%, 16% reflects exactly the split that the Royal Navy had when they built their flotillas with eight or 10 private ships and a destroyer leader. What a surprise. There was a bit of wiggle room around the definitions, around the different categories, so ships allowances could be moved between the different ones, so type A cruisers, type B cruisers, destroyers. There could be a bit of wiggle room. It also introduced the sort of proportions between the different sizes of forces between Britain, the US, and Japan. And again, the Japanese were limited to only a proportion of the US and Royal Navy, where the percentage they were allowed was increased in the, in inverted commas, lesser or smaller ships, although I'll come on to what that actually meant. I've called this slide underlying politics going in and coming out, but really it's about winners and losers. Fundamentally, I think 4 of the 5 powers that went into this got what they were after, and I think one got completely shafted. The British wanted to be able to build 8,000 tons, 6-inch armed cruisers that weren't going to just be completely smashed by a wall of 8-inch gun armed 10,000 ton cruisers if we ever sent them anywhere, on the sort of trade protection imperial policing role. The US didn't want to see cruisers being limited to anything less than 10,000 tons displacement, because they didn't think that anything less than 10,000 tons standard displacement would be of any use for them in the Pacific. The French and Italians were in an interesting place in that the French wanted to move away from being put on a parity with the Italians, whilst the Italians wanted to retain the appearance of parity with France. The French also wanted to have the freedom to construct submarines, cruisers and destroyers in an unlimited manner, particularly not trusting the English speakers who had somewhat dominated things and they felt had pushed their own agendas at Washington, but also they were starting to get a little bit twitchy about the Germans, who had of course just started to build the first of their Panzerschiff and if anyone calls them pocket battleships, we may shoot them. The Japanese just seem to have been screwed over. I can't really say it in any other way, and honestly, I don't know why they agreed to this. The limits that were created seem to have been entirely generated with a view to limiting the Japanese and blocking them off. So, going through briefly, the 10,000-ton aircraft carriers no longer being sort of not counted. Well, that was targeting the Japanese, who were building a sub 10,000-ton aircraft carrier to try and enable them to create a degree of equality or comparability in terms of force. The Japanese were also working on having a very large submarine fleet, so being limited to the same as the Royal Navy and US Navy was useless to them when they wanted to be about 150% of what they were allowed, aiming for over 70,000 standard displacement tons of submarine forces, and a lot of them were going to be large cruiser types of over 2,000 tons, the idea being that they would use this sort of force to whittle down the American superiority in capital ships, whilst they were transiting the wide Pacific, and also to act in a scouting role. The destroyers was another thing that was created in response to Japanese developments. Their Fubuki class and successors had been a complete shock to everyone. They were significantly larger and more powerful than anyone else's destroyers and completely upset the apple cart. The idea of limiting them to only 16% of these slightly larger destroyers was entirely focused on the Japanese, who'd intended to not use these as some sort of destroyer leader, but instead in their own flotillas, which would then act by firing multiple salvos of torpedoes at long range, again to try and thin down the US battle fleet superiority prior to the clash of the main forces. At the time of the treaty, these Fubuki class made up something in the region of 40% of the Japanese destroyer force tonnage. Again, the limit on the cruisers was a reaction to the fact that the Americans were far behind the Japanese in terms of build and development of the heavy cruisers, whilst the Royal Navy had realised they simply couldn't afford to build as many as they wanted. Japan had gone to the conference looking to secure a redrawing of the force allocation ratios from the 5:3 or 10:6 ratio to 10:7, a thing which had been a sore point since the Washington Conference of 1922. Clearly, they didn't get it. Really, I don't know why they accepted it, why they agreed to this, and I wonder whether that was another brick in the wall of stopping the Japanese liberal movement that had been running since, to some extent, since the Meiji Restoration, and certainly for the first 30 years or so of the 20th century, which was then rapidly overtaken by the kind of extreme nationalist side, as happened in an awful lot of places in the 1930s, Italy just being ahead of the game by going fascist in the 1920s, and the Russians opting out of that by going communist in the 19-teens, with Stalin's Russia totally distinguishable from other abhorrent regimes of the time, completely honest, totally. And that's about 20 minutes. So, very quickly, find Alex Clarke on Twitter at AC_Naval History. Find his book on Amazon. Find him in other exciting places. And, yeah, you probably won't find me, but don't worry about that.